Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the Place Your Trades Network Spaces to discuss global supply chains and commodities. This Spaces is brought to you by Tradeovate, which has a built-in custom web app dedicated to trading CME Group's new daily option contracts, including indices, energy, metals, and now Bitcoin. You can now trade these on the DOM on Tradeovate's main platform as well. They're a great way to get exposures to the futures market with defined risk. You can use the link in my Twitter stream to go and get the Tradeovate app for free. I also write a weekly blog on markets there that you can find at placeyourtrades.com. Go under chigrl's blog and just sign up. It's free. So we'll get to introducing, oh yay, everybody's here now. Introducing our guest, we have Ross Kennedy. Ross Kennedy is the founder of Fortis Analysis, a strategic consultancy that serves public and private sector clients operating at the nexus of geoeconomics and national security. He's a logistics industry veteran with 17 years direct experience in operating agribusiness, chemical, energy, humanitarian, food, defense, and water supply chains. His Twitter handle is at MapHumanIntent. He also writes a Substack at fortisanalysis.substack.com. You can click on his bio. There's a link in there. Next, we have Chris Balding. Chris Balding was a professor at the Fulbright University, Vietnam, and at HSBC Business School of Peking University Graduate School. He specializes in Chinese economy, financial markets, and technology. He's the founder of New Kite Data Labs think tank. He specializes in the most advanced cutting-edge tech and economic data. Having lived in China and Vietnam for more than a decade, he's now back, relocated to the United States. And last but not least, we have Tony Nash. Tony Nash is the CEO and founder of Complete Intelligence. Previously, Tony built and led the global research business for The Economist and the Asia consulting business for IHS, which is now part of S&P. He's a frequent public speaker and contributor to leading global media and has served as an advisor to governments and think tanks in Tokyo, Singapore, Beijing, Washington, D.C., and others. He's also an international advisory board member for Texas A&M University. He has a master's degree in IR from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and a BA in business management from Texas A&M. He's a big family Texas A&M guy. All right, now we'll get started. We'll start how we do this usually. Since Ross and Chris haven't been, I just go around. Each person asks some questions. And we just keep going around so nobody sits not talking for a long time. If you have anything to add to what anybody else has said, feel free to go ahead and do so. So we'll start with Ross first. So first, what are some of the key challenges associated with managing global supply chains, in particular for commodities?
Hey, Tracy. Hey, everyone. So it's a huge question.
I know,
usually
sorry.
No, it's fine. Usually with big questions, I start with sort of a first principle, right? For me, increasingly, the first principle is understanding that in this competitive environment, it's increasingly zero sum for a lot of reasons that probably some of which we'll discuss here. And in that particular case, it's less about he who has the gold makes the rules. It's more about he who is willing to lie, cheat, steal their way to accessing that particular commodity is who makes the rules. And so if you are, broadly speaking, of course, many examples to the contrary, but broadly speaking, if you are a European and American company, from an ethics standpoint, from a corporate governance standpoint, we're kind of playing from behind the eight ball in a lot of parts of the world where geostrategic competitors, largely to the West, China in particular, but Russia as well, and a lot of others, they're willing to do a lot more, blur the lines ethically or cross them completely to secure specific resources. And at the end of the day, in a lot of cases, resources is a zero-sum game. So for me, it's understanding that going into it, we have likely to have competitors. We're likely to have logistics service providers. We're likely to have finance people involved in this that are at some level or another. We can't always trust their motivations. And so with that, you have to take more of a, not just an economically competitive approach to it, but almost like a warlike approach where I'm going to beat you to it. I'm going to give you the better deal. And then they can, and then I'm going to have probably tried to find 3 or 4 or 5 ways to blunt the competitor's opportunity to secure that same resource. We're very fortunate in the U.S. To have an abundance of many natural resources that we import the majority of. We need to be doing more on that, right? So for me, in my case, if I've got a client that comes to me and says, I really need graphite. Well, there's a finite amount of places in the world where you can get really high quality fine graphite that's easily extracted, easily refined, in an easily transportable state. So instead of saying, well, where's the resource and how do I buy it? It becomes, where's the resource and how do I create an economic and political strategy that sort of encircles the entire scope of the project in ways that I can control.
Excellent. And then, so what are you seeing some of like the biggest trends and challenges facing the commodity industry and the supply chains today? And that could be, Russia risk or anything else.
Probably the biggest one is going to be because we've got a world that's largely been built on globalization, and that's sort of falling to pieces in a lot of cases. Very stable laws and systems of governance that, if we're talking about on the ocean, the International Maritime Organization, if we're talking in the US, MARAD and some of the, the FMC. So the political and regulatory environment is kind of falling apart a little bit. There's very inconsistent enforcement of laws and very inconsistent enforcement of good practices amongst ship owners. That's one challenge. An even bigger challenge is consistency of partnerships. Globalization, moving a resource from A to B really relies on having a stable network of partners that is durable, that they are going to be with you for the long haul. And I'm starting to see, pardon me, a lot of phone calls coming in here. Starting to see a situation where partners aren't trusting each other now, particularly for moving things from A to B. Not only so, it's not just access to capital, it's not just regulatory, it's the fact that everything is becoming hyper-transactional. Everything is becoming, to one extent or another, very short-term thinking. And so if you're not giving the better deal on this particular transaction, you risk losing it, and you could potentially risk losing it for a long time, and that could be oil. It could be grains, it could be animal feed ingredients, it could be specific chemicals. Finally, and the biggest one, it's one we probably will talk more about here, is from a geopolitical side, China has been following an approach of really accessing resources, and not only accessing them, but securing them and guaranteeing them and stockpiling them or controlling them while they're still in the ground, and then building the refining, extraction, and transportation capacity on top of that. That's a huge first mover advantage. In a lot of cases, we haven't solved it, and we're finding that to be more of a challenge now and in the coming years than it has been even in the last 10 or 15.
So quick back to your point before that. So are you seeing, basically, are you saying you're seeing shorter term contracts rather than locking in longer term contracts, which I know for energy in particular, they prefer those?
Yeah, for numerous things. So for some of the work that I'm doing in Africa and in Asia with some critical materials, it could be rare earths, it could be things that you need for creating semiconductor chips or components for military material, also for food and food and feed ingredients, grain, fertilizers, chemicals. I'm seeing more and more and more people not willing to lock in the long-term price, not willing to lock in the long-term relationship. They're wanting to maximize the value of every single deal instead of building around the relationship. That's in a lot of these domains, that's very novel because most people typically will they're willing to trade back and forth, I guess, at least in my experience, between money and certainty, security and money. And now I think we're starting to see, at least from a Western perspective, a lot of traditional centers of trade or resource availability or buyers of our own material that we generate here in the US and elsewhere. It's becoming just a lot more transactional and thus a lot more risky from a CapEx planning standpoint, from putting on contracts that can help you stabilize your fuel prices or stabilize your transportation. So the risks are going up on all sides, mainly because everything is moving to a very short-term thinking.
Thank you, and we'll come back to you. Let's move to Chris. Let's talk about China for a little bit. So, how do the government policies in China kind of impact energy and metals, or actually just commodities in general, global supply chains, and what are some of the key policies employed, and what are some of the dangers?
Well, I think Ross, to build upon what he said, is very accurate. And one of the challenges you face is, unlike a lot of the oil and energy and mineral companies that might be looking to do business, when Chinese companies fly into different parts of the world, they fly in not just with their internal team, but they fly in with the construction company, the bankers that are willing to write the checks. And the government policymakers that say, and will grant waivers for this to be done on an import free tariff free basis, and so that is a radically different approach to securing that minerals, and as Ross alluded to, locking them up longer term. Where in the free market you just don't have even the biggest producers. If you think of like an ExxonMobil, even they would be stretched, and it would take them a lot more energy to bring about those types of resources flying in to secure deals, and that really changes the ball game for, as Ross said, how you're trying to think about this, whether it's longer term or shorter term. You just don't have that luxury, and so I'm hearing similar things about the types of deals that people are making.
So, what are some of the ethical considerations involved in commodity production and supply chains in China?
You're assuming that there are ethical standards, I think, is the mistake that you make, Tracy. Some of the stories that you hear are simply legendary. But I think more importantly, one of the things is a lot of Chinese industry is structured in a sense that there's 2 to 3 companies that dominate pretty much every industrial metal, energy, commodity, something like that, and then a lot of, especially in like the oil, what we would call the teapot sectors, and so basically a lot of those individual companies or sectors that where the companies will openly collaborate with each other, so it's basically a monopoly. They basically have the size that they are, even within China, some of those individual companies are almost feared. They're considered a state within a state, and so even internationally, they will basically, they've been known in some places to basically set up what amounts to their own sovereign quasi-state, and some of these companies are very well known for fighting very hard with Beijing if they don't get what they want or get the resources that they believe they're due. And so, as Ross kind of alluded to, this really does change the game. I mean, there really is, very little rules, because they will, the stories that we could sit here and go over, truly are legendary. And it really does. If you're a Western and you're having to worry about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or other things like that, in a way, and I think it's reasonable, but it really does put you at a very different on a very different playing field than your Chinese competitors.
Oh, and then Just with regard to, I don't know how to phrase this question that well, but with regards to renewables, China holds most of the world's rare earth metals and processing, as well as, the supply chains for solar panels. So what are the dangers of this consolidation? Is it even possible to circumvent China?
Well, so on rare earths, it absolutely is. It absolutely is possible. I think, as you know better than most, rare earths really aren't that rare. The rarity comes in where do you build the processing and refining plants, which are notoriously dirty environmentally. But China has basically said that they have no qualms doing that. And I think one of the things is that there's a lot of change in the West right now, saying, hey, we need to be able to do this because, if you look back at, let's say, I think it was 10, 15 years ago at this point, China and some of those metals had more than 90% market share, and then after they did the blockade, people started looking around and said, hey, we need to find other ways. There was recycling. There were a couple of additional refineries that came online, and I think a lot of companies are facing a similar issue. And then in addition, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act has contributed to saying, hey, we need to move our supply chains, and so I think people are really it's really forcing the issue to use the term that is popular, to decouple and say we need to diversify our supply chains, because more than anything, as any large company should be considering, you are running enormous risk basically putting all your supply chain eggs in one basket.
Thank you. Just solid information. I'll move to Tony now. I know you have studied BRI a lot, have talked a lot about it in the past, but I kind of wanted you to kind of give us an update on the current state of BRI, and then how has this impacted commodity production and trade in the regions, and what implication does this have for global supply chains?
Okay, Tracy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks for having me today. This really means a lot. I appreciate it. Let me start first by saying that Complete Intelligence, we forecast commodity prices and equity prices and so on. And we had foreseen a lot of the updraft in prices for things like crude and gold and so on for the month of April. We had overestimated the rise of things like aluminum, but in general, a lot of the broadly traded commodities, we had seen this updraft. We do foresee a downdraft in those prices starting in May, June. Okay, so typically when there is demand coming into those sectors, because of economic pressures, we're starting to see a downdraft there. So that includes places like Asia, where we had expected a lot of demand pull through with the opening in China. And while it's been there, it's been less than expected. With regard to the BRI, as I've said many times, and I'll kind of tell the story as briefly as possible. In 2015-16, I was inside the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, advising on several aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative, including things like anti-corruption. To be clear, I was never paid by the Chinese government. They never even reimbursed my expenses. At the time, it was such a very interesting program that I just wanted to have a front row seat to it. So understanding first, how does the Chinese bureaucracy work? And second of all, what happened with the Belt and Road Initiative and what was happening? What do I see happening lately? Well, it's, the vision of the Belt and Road Initiative really fell apart in 2017. So what you're seeing when people talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, which I put in quotes, it's really just a magnet for international products to justify Xi Jinping's speech in Kazakhstan in 2013, where he talked about the Belt and Road Initiative initially. And Xi Jinping cannot be seen to fail with the BRI because he's put so much behind it. So, so what it had become, what it was originally envisioned to be was a debt-driven program where $1 trillion, notice we say dollars and not CNY, but $1 trillion was intended to be put toward infrastructure projects inside and outside of China. Those were debt instruments. And those debt instruments, the Indonesians were the first to catch on to this. Those debt instruments were only 5% of the total operating cost, lifetime operating cost of that infrastructure. So the Indonesians would take debt out for the first 5%, and then they would be left holding the equity position for 100% of that asset, and they'd have to pay for 95% of the lifetime value of that asset. So what happened is they insisted that China, through its various organizations, take an equity stake in those assets. So China not only converted its debt to equity, but they also are on the hook for operations and upkeep of those assets for the lifetime of that asset. So where China wanted to be in and out with a debt commitment in 5 years, they're now on the hook for an equity portion for the next 40 to 50 years in a lot of places that are very unpredictable. Okay. So what you see is this glorious victory of the Belt and Road Initiative portrayed in media is really just putting a Band-Aid over what has become an uncontrollable mess. And it's really driven by China Exim Bank and China Development Bank and the State Council and the National Development and Reform Committee. So now what it was intended to do was to really draw on a lot of Chinese labor because there was a glut of semi-skilled labor in China. And it was intended to create a draw for commodities, which China was buying and continues to buy in force. So, so sure, has that happened? Yes, it's happened, but it's been very divisive in the countries where they've entered. And if you look at the domestic politics of a place like Pakistan today, it's really created ripple effects that the Chinese really find incredibly inconvenient. So a couple of things that have been said earlier in the conversation, and you know, Chris and Ross are incredibly smart, and I love talking with them about these things. Tracy, you asked about the ethical standards of commodities, of sourcing commodities in China. I just want us all to kind of take a deep breath and understand that the West outsources our ethical standards to China, okay? Meaning we know what's happening in China with commodities mining. We know it. The people who contract with Chinese commodity companies know what's happening. But because there's a contract and a corporate entity between those activities and it reaching a product that's made by an American company or for an American company, we turn a blind eye and accept the ethical standards or lack thereof that happens in China and with Chinese companies operating in places like Indonesia. So we can be shocked and we can act like we have a real problem with it, but in fact, we keep buying those goods and we keep contracting to those Chinese companies. So we, by the kind of outcome in our continued behavior, actually accept and even endorse those quote unquote ethical practices that happen in China. The other part that I think is important to understand is that central planners love to hoard. If you look at Chinese history, if you look at history of the Soviet Union and so on, central planners love to hoard. They love to hoard commodities. They love to hoard finished goods. They love to hoard everything. Okay, so so there has been this unending story over the last decade of China hoarding copper, China hoarding crude oil, China hoarding other things. That is just the nature of central planning, because a central planning economy does not have to clear, okay? A market economy has to clear. If it doesn't clear, there are write-downs. Look at the commercial real estate sector right now and so on, right? So if a market economy doesn't clear, it's inefficient, and investors will take advantage of those inefficiencies. In a centrally planned economy, they don't have to clear. So they can hoard whatever they want, real estate, copper, crude oil, anything. Okay. So this kind of discussion about there being an unbalanced relationship with China and commodities, it's true. But when China doesn't clear and they don't mark their hoarded assets to market, that is just a problem waiting to happen. And of course, the Chinese government has a lot of money, and of course, they can wait a long, long time. And of course, I'm not personally going to short any of that stuff. But this stuff comes home to roost. I don't know when, but it does. I think the final question that I would, or kind of final item that I would raise is with commodities and with a lot of the recent discussion about using CNY for commodity purchases and cross-border purchases. One of the things that I never hear anybody talk about is trade finance. And trade finance in CNY is a real question mark. China Exim Bank and CDB, China Development Bank, can try to write trade finance documents on CNY, but the vast majority of trade finance happens in US dollars because that is the insurance policy that the shipper is going to actually get what is agreed with the buyer. So, and now trade finance is a very murky area. There's almost no transparency in trade finance, but until we start to see trade finance turn, then a lot of what we're seeing in the headlines around commodities being traded in non-US currencies, it's all just front of stage stuff without a lot of substance.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back really fast on this BRI thing. Mm-hmm. I just want to ask, so I know we're seeing a lot of particularly in Africa, we're seeing a lot of breakdown politically between kind of, the Chinese government that's over there and the local and state governments. Do you see this blowing up spectacularly at some point? And will they at some point get tired of China being in their country and thus affect trade and commodities? Because really they're over there pilfering, right?
So do I see African governments being unstable? Is that the question?
Do you see at any point where, we'll see some of these countries, these BRI countries, basically cutting China off, or are they too in debt to them at this point?
So 4 or 5 years ago, I was having discussions with African government officials on how they can break and restructure their agreements with China on BRI. They felt like they were trapped. They wanted to move more in the Indonesian direction of restructuring for an equity investment rather than a debt investment. Very few of them had the ability to act on it, partly because of sorry, I think I lost you for a minute, but partly because of the lack of clarity on their roles within the respective governments in Africa. So, I think a lot of these banks and Chinese companies that are, we'll say Chinese banks and Chinese companies operating in Africa have really bribed their way into operating at the central government level. So I think in order for things to change in Africa, at least the relationships with, say, quote unquote, Belt and Road projects, I think we're going to have to see a Sri Lankan level of government deterioration. A lot of frustration in Sri Lanka was around Hambantota Port and other ports in Sri Lanka. So we're going to have to see that level of frustration at the national level in Africa in order for things to change. I don't know how far off that is. I don't really know African politics that well.
All right, thank you. Very much. Now back to Ross. I kind of wanted to ask. So, how have recent trade policies such as tariffs, trade agreements, et cetera, impacted U.S. supply chains, and what implications do these policies have for global supply chains?
Well, that's a really interesting
That's
one.
another big question.
That's all right. We'll eat the elephant one bite at a time here. If we really chunk it down to what the most basic things are, we have sort of two things on an individual human level: the things that really can often drive policies and politics, particularly in where we have sort of a biannual political cycle in the U.S. and then a quadrennial political cycle. The bottom of Maslow's hierarchy will frequently hold true: food, water, and energy as the main three. If we look at what is the lifeblood of the U.S. economy, we are fundamentally high-tech manufacturing and R&D in some cases. We still do some industrial, but a lot of what we do, we're primarily a consumptive, sort of service-driven economy, finance-driven economy. And so some of these real factors that are impacting the rest of the world don't have as much of a downstream impact into people's individual lives at home. So as a matter of trade policy and things that we're doing to try to kind of reshift the balance of power back towards us, keeping costs down, fighting inflation, availability of things, we seem to be doing everything wrong. It's almost as if, and hear me out here, but it's almost as if we're a country of people that's ruled by a bunch, like a Mandarin class that's never really been outside of the DC or Wall Street bubble, which is shocking to some. But for the rest of us that live in the real world, when we look at the price of eggs going up, the impetus is to say, what is the political fix for this? Well, there isn't a political fix. The chickens were dying because of avian flu. Prices continue to stay high because of high energy prices, because of high feed prices, because 60% of the amino acids that we consume in this country in animal feed come from China. Something like 90% of the vitamins come from China. And so we're looking for a political solution because that's the easy thing to do, is to throw checks at people to make the pain stop. When we anchor ourselves then in this value of, we produce food abundantly, we capable of producing energy abundantly, we continue to do everything we can to get in our own way. We make it more difficult to extract natural gas and exploit it for its many industrial uses. It's not just a feedstock for fuel, right? It's a direct manufacturing input for so many things. So why aren't we utilizing it in more creative ways at the state level? We just keep looking at the old things for the same problems. When we look at the issue, as Chris said, rare earths are not that rare, not truly as far as actual abundance. But what is rare is refining capacity for these, at least relative to the amount, of raw material available. What is rare are companies that are Western aligned, that we can, do trade with. I saw in the comments, Linus was brought up, one of the very few players, right, that's available to us, whereas China has numerous companies. And more than that, they're willing to poison the people, poison the soil for that short-term gain, to gain that competitive edge. 30 years ago, they said, well, we'll do the extraction, right? And they had artisanal mining the same way the Congo does for cobalt. And people were scraping metal out of the ground with pickaxes and then dying because they were trying to refine things right there and they were being poisoned to death. And then China said, fine, we'll do that too. We'll take the high-end refining and become a critical part of the front end of your supply chain. And now what became, we'll dig it out of the earth with our bare hands in 30 years has become the dominant refining sector. So there's a lot of places available for, and U.S. trade policy isn't really addressing any of that. We're not addressing it's not just how do we get our hands on the stuff, it's how do we refine it? And how do we then exploit that new refining capacity or new modalities of R&D or technology or manufacturing practices to attract better partnerships and better relationships? It's one of the reasons. There's a couple people that were on here that heard me at a Hillsdale event back in October, delivered the same message to a large group of people in Seattle last week. Our conception of free trade politically and economically in the U.S., in my view, is fundamentally broken. We call it free trade. You get Cato Institute and the Quincy Institute and all these others that are funded by the Koch brothers and all these other things. And going at the Kochs is probably dumb on an energy intensive discussion, but At the end of the day, the conception of free trade that we pretend to be operating under is not free trade. It's just a bunch of walled gardens with little tunnels in between them, rather than truly free trade, because free trade can only exist in the presence of common interest, common goodwill, and mutually aligned security interests. Any policy, in my view, that doesn't take a look at the U.S. strengths and weaknesses and then immediately targets trade relationships and resource-rich countries that have a natural security alignment with the U.S. And to build mutually beneficial relationships around financial policy, around economic policy, around security policy. If we're not doing those things now, we're completely missing the boat. The rest of this is elementary because so many of the commodities are just going to follow sort of the natural lines of relationships that are emerging. A lot of people, like Tony's correct, a lot of countries don't want to trade with China, but China's the only deal they had for 20 years. And so now they've got crumbling Chinese roads. They've got many Chinese expats living in their communities. There's a depth of a stickiness, if you will, to the national relationships between China, who came in and wanted a resource, the country who had the resource got caught in the resource trap or the debt trap, but they don't really have a better option. And we're not doing a good job in terms of weighing tariffs, anti-dumping, and countervailing duties. Like, we threw a 19% anti-dumping duty on Moroccan phosphate because Mosaic, the pride of the U.S. fertilizer industry, threw a hissy fit that they can't extract Florida phosphates cheaper and compete with Morocco. So rather than finding a way to work together, they pushed a 2-year trade case, and now phosphate fertilizers in the U.S. are less available and they're up in price. And then when you take the twin aspect of making natural gas harder to access, harder to utilize from a regulatory side, well, now we can't make compound fertilizers, one of the key ingredients to feed ourselves. So there's a recursive relationship, negative or positive, between these policies that we have, and they're devastating. So we're selecting too much for corporate interests in the U.S. and selecting too much against creating intelligent alliances that are sort of mutually reinforcing with trade of commodities, trade of finished goods, but also national security concerns of those countries and ours.
So how realistic is it? I know we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and they want to bring a lot of these supply chains back to the U.S., yet nobody can get permitting, right? It takes 10 years just to get a permit. And then you just have somebody like Minnesota, which just said, no, you can't mine copper here for 20 years. So is it even possible, are our energy policies conflicting so that it's putting us at a stalemate, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a matter of incentives. And where the incentives are not in play, serious ideological blinders are in play. The inmates really have control of the asylum on energy policy in the U.S. And as important as food and water are, energy is arguably even more so, because the only way to extract and move food and water from Mother Earth is to have a good energy policy that makes it possible to have infrastructure and transportation capacity for that material. So when we look in the U.S., it's one of the reasons I was briefing one of the Senate committees last year, and they were wanting to talk about food security, trying to get a hold of the head of the whole Farm Bill 2024. And there were Democrats and Republicans in the room both. And I said, if you guys this is the one way I'll know you're serious about actually doing something with the Farm Bill, about actually doing something about food security in the U.S., is you need to start hooking energy incentives and food incentives together so that we are able to produce both in abundance. And when they said, what do you mean? I said, create a regulatory fast lane that if any new project started in the last 24 months moving forward, whether it's greenfield or whether it's a rip and replace, upgrades, whatever it may be, but if you're creating new energy capacity or transmission capacity in the US, and at least 50% of whatever unit of measure you want to use, therms if it's natural gas or BTUs or whatever, but if at least 50% of new capacity that goes in is targeted directly into food, fuel, or fertilizer production within a certain, even called within a certain geographic area, it doesn't require a FERC permit. And you have a 6-month presumptive approval. The government has 6 months to basically say no, and here's why. So you put these regulatory fast lanes in, and you watch how fast American capital comes in off the sidelines. You watch how fast that dollar that's going to South America comes to the US to put in. I mean, you're right, it is. It's 3 to 5 years to get permitting to create new vitamin manufacturing in the US. It's 24 months to actually build the facility and $300 to $500 million to do it. So you'll spend twice as much time and the same amount of money just to get the permits in place at the state and regulatory and national level, just to build a plant. You know, we have to think differently about what the problem is. From a policy side, we have to think differently. That's where the incentives come in. And that's where finding ways to, for somehow to get the biofuel lobby to agree with the fossil fuel lobby that both rely on robust agriculture production in the US to be able to grow their own sectors. You know, that type of thinking, rather than antagonistic, they need to be banding up together and beating the hell out of their representatives and out of their senators on these issues and saying, DC needs to get out of our way, let American money get in here, and then transportation, infrastructure, those things follow from stability and good, positive, growth-oriented policies.
You're hired. Done. I vote you in office. You're it.
They're tired of hearing me in DC.
So let's do something like on, let's switch this to a little bit of a lighter note. So what are some promising new technology in the areas of, say, global commodity supply chains? And how are these technologies being used to optimize production and distribution, if there are any? Trying to find a silver lining today.
Yeah, so definitely seeing a push more towards, and this is good and bad, more towards a push of utilizing AI and computational power to reduce the amount of errors that company, you know, for example, regulatory compliance with customs and FDA is a real challenge in the US. It's, you know, particularly with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act coming in and things like that. We're starting to see companies, at least here in the US, I've set up a couple companies to begin to do this and think this way, utilizing technology in lieu of human brain power to perform like repeatable processes like scanning for errors in shipping documents, making sure that HTS codes are correct when you're filing customs entries. That type of stuff does have a compounding effect on a company's ability to focus on what's important. And that's particularly true when you're talking about trade, logistics, and supply chains. So very, very encouraged by that. One of the other things that I'm truly encouraged by is it's still too slow, but it is growing and it's escalating in terms of how high people, you know, up in the government, people are starting to look at the problem set, is the issue of shipbuilding. And then adjacent to that, of course, is mill writing, steel working, you know, all of these metals and, you know, downstream and upstream components that go into ships starting to become a thing. You know, talks with Hyundai, talks with, you know, Austal, talks with these companies, both on the military and on the commercial side, that the US was once the global leader in shipbuilding, and now we've completely ceded that for the most part to China, with Korea and Japan still being extremely strong in it. But that's really, for the first time in 20 years, some of these serious conversations are being had about how do we revitalize the shipbuilding industry in the US, and, you know, certainly more pleas on that. The other thing that I think we're starting to see more of is a lot of countries, particularly places that have historically been resource rich, but, you know, maybe knowledge worker poor, or you don't have the skilled labor to extract and make use of resources indigenously, so they just get mined out and shipped somewhere else, usually China. We're starting to see some of these countries tap into 21st century technology. And excuse me, someone tried to dial in here, but on me. But we're seeing now some of these countries beginning to try to upskill their own labor force, beginning to be a larger part of the value add to any given commodity before it leaves their own country. And I think that actually does favor Western interests, U.S. interests. It selects against China, whose entire model is really built around coercion and dependency to some extent. Really seeing that in food and agribusiness. I think the Russia-Ukraine situation over the last year plus, how just shutting down the Black Sea had such a deep and profound impacts on a lot of countries' food security. The reality is asserting itself in a lot of cases, good and bad. And the use of technology, the use of better processes is really kind of an overlooked story where we always focus on money. We focus on physical capacity to move things, physical capacity to extract and mine. But the finance piece is becoming less important. A lot of companies, a lot of countries are really starting to ask themselves the question of what does it look like when it all falls apart, and we have to in some way take care of ourselves. And those are good and profoundly positive things. The last thing I would say is the rise of India as really central to, if we accept that the world at some level, the world's not de-dollarizing, but if we accept at some level that the world is bifurcating, that we're largely kind of pulling apart into two spheres of influence here, and geoeconomic and geostrategic cooperation, the importance of India in particular at kind of sitting astride both of those worlds and refusing to budge, that from a supply chain perspective, when I look at it, is a positive thing, to the extent that the U.S. is willing to work with and accept India's status as a peer in a lot of ways. And we need to treat them that way. Those are very good things and give me a lot of hope and a lot of positivity that we will, if we can just kind of level set our priorities correctly over the next 3 to 5 years, that some of the natural decay that comes with communism, the entropy, the destruction of human freedom, that there is a defined end state. Whether you agree with the demographic decline of China, or you agree that maybe their currency is never going to be stable enough that they can assert themselves as the dominant hyperpower of the world, whatever that may be, at the end of the day, in my view, communism is a fundamentally destructive system for economic and liberty creation. The U.S., for all of its problems, still kind of orients that direction. So I do think that in trade relationships, logistics and supply chain relationships, we're already starting to see kind of the early light on the horizon of countries figuring that out for themselves and wanting to try to align themselves in a more positive way, and I would say away from total dependence on China.
Absolutely. I 100% agree about India, and we should keep our eye on that. I mean, because if you look at just the demographics of China, right, they're an aging population, their population is shrinking, and India just literally surpassed China already as far as population is concerned, and they have a lot more, everybody considers China an emerging market, but it's really not. I think they've emerged. They're changing to a consumer economy. So, I think all eyes on India. My 2 cents on that. So back to Tony. I think we lost Chris. I invited him back up here. Hopefully he can come back up. I don't know. He fell out. So we'll go to Tony. So I wanted to ask we talk a lot about the need of supply chains to move out of China, particularly after COVID. So are we seeing any evidence of this? And where are some countries that we should be looking at, aside from India, since we just talked about it, that we could see some of these supply chains moving to out of China?
Sure, I think that's a great point, Tracy. So, of course, Vietnam is one that everyone talks about. I think the problem with Vietnam is just one of capacity. Vietnam is not even close to the population of China's, say, PRD or, say, Pearl River Delta or Yangtze River Delta. So it's a smaller country, and the West has a great relationship with Vietnam and has for 30 years. So, I think that's a pretty safe place to put stuff. Places like Thailand and Malaysia are also good alternative locations. I think, especially with a place like Malaysia and probably Thailand, we have to be really careful about the China component of those manufacturers, meaning are, say, Thailand and Malaysia simply kind of later stage assembly points of goods, that basic goods that are manufactured in China or something. It's something we have to be really careful about. With India, I love India. There's a lot I like about India. I've been going to India for decades. We do have to be careful. India can be a very fickle trade partner, and supply chains from India can be really precarious at times. So the more we come to rely on India, and by we I mean the West, we're going to have to invest a lot in things like ship rotations to India, domestic supply chain interconnections, those sorts of things. What's been really encouraging to me over the past couple of years is hearing about the transition, especially of electronics supply chains to places like Mexico. Mexico really, I think the proximity to the US and so on, obviously very helpful. It de-risks a fair bit of those electronic supply chains. Whenever I hear a lot of people talk about Mexico, they talk about how China, could potentially partner with Mexico. I wrote years ago, probably 5-6 years ago, about how actually China and Mexico are trade competitors. They're not really partners. Given where each one is in their skills, given where each one is in their wage level, and so on and so forth, China and Mexico are really competitors. It's not that one necessarily feeds into the other. So Mexico is a fabulous alternative for the US to source electronics and other goods. So I'm hoping and expecting that Mexico becomes really that strategic partner for the US, or one of those strategic partners. To be clear, we're never going to take China out of the supply chain, nor do we want to. I think all we're trying to do is de-risk the concentration of supply from China. So we want to be friends with China. We want to have trade relationships with China. But we, as the West, specifically the US, need to really de-risk our concentration of goods that come from China.
What are your thoughts on South America? We've seen a lot of new leftist governments that have been talking about, they want to get away from fossil fuels and whatever. And a lot of these countries are large producers of, oil and gas. So there's a lot of, oil and gas discovered. Guyana's huge right now. So what are your thoughts on South America as, say, to look to as supply chains? I mean, we obviously have a big partnership with Brazil, but what are your thoughts in general on South America?
I think, sadly, South America has been kind of the promise that just really isn't realized in many ways outside of a handful of things. So I would really hope that we could help South America develop into reliable trade partners. I would really hope that there could be more stability in South American governments in order to allow us to build those reliable trade partnerships. But it's, from an institutional perspective, it's very difficult to build those reliable relationships with many South American countries. So I'm all for it. I'm just not necessarily seeing these things materialize. When you look at the trade relationship between, say, Brazil and the US, it's tiny. It's really tiny. It should be a lot more than it is. So, why is it tiny? Well, it's just it's an unreliable trade partner from a trade policy perspective, and it's an unreliable trade partner from an institutional perspective, meaning can those governments ensure that that trade will keep moving? I mean, look, we can say as many bad things about China as we want, but they, 30 years ago created a very efficient government structure, corrupt or not. Of course, there was a lot of corruption involved in this, but they created a very efficient government structure that helped facilitate manufacturing and trade. Now, do I love that government structure? Would I endorse that as the future of global governance? Absolutely not. But it was convenient for a lot of Westerners as wages were rising to globalize and concentrate manufacturing in China. And that was a deal. Everyone knew it. And we've just kind of overdone it now.
Thank you. Okay, Chris is back up and Ross fell out. Chris, back to you. So, yeah, how have China's efforts kind of to transition to more of a service-oriented economy kind of impacted its commodity industry, its manufacturing industry, and what implications does this have for global supply chains?
I think there's a couple of issues there. I think it significantly overstates that there is a shift towards significant consumption in the Chinese economy. If you actually look at the data just as a starting point, in most OECD type countries, household income will be roughly 65 to 75% of GDP. In China, it's, depending on the year, it's 40 to 45%. So GDP is significantly overstating, individual spending capacity. And then you layer on that in China, they are more indebted at the consumer level than almost every OECD household by country, and we simply aren't seeing, basically broad-based consumer recovery in China. And a lot of this simply has to do with how, basically how, where China is getting hit weakness. It's basically very, very expensive to employ people in China, especially for what they had historically climbed up the value chain, starting with in lower wage skilled areas, and now in the higher skilled areas, they, if you think as a simple example, semiconductors, they simply don't have the global quality that is demanded. There's some in that middle area, but that's a much smaller middle. So basically, they're squeezed at the top, they're squeezed at the bottom, and there's a little bit in the middle there. And I think this is basically only going to get worse for China, because as we've talked about supply chains and all of these kinds of things, I'm remembering when I was in Vietnam a couple of years ago and was talking with a friend there, and they ran a basically basic garment manufacturing operation, and I asked, I said, well, how automated are you right now? And they said, we're about 25% automated, and within 5-6 years we will be likely 100% automated. And I said, so basically we are approaching the end of where basic goods get traded out, across national borders. And they said, and you can see this more and more even in shopping malls and things like that. We're nearing the end of the time where there's even a need to make jeans or T-shirts or lots and lots of basic goods in other countries. What is the point? And so this bears very well for countries like Mexico, but I think it also speaks to, when we talk about supply chains, what are the supply chains that we're referring to? What are we talking about with manufacturing? The labor rate of that robot is going to be the same whether it's in the United States or in another country. And so I think that is radically changing, as we've dealt with as we've seen ChatGPT, how I think one thing people have not thought much about at all is, how is that going to change manufacturing and actually building things? And I know people that are basically either trying to hire for, let's say, manufacturing type of operations, or college graduates that are moving into that, and there just aren't enough people that they can hire to actually do the building operations. And then the last thing I'll say before I shut up is I think what Ross was talking about with permitting and everything like that is incredibly key. My wife, who is an engineer, she was recently working on, to be honest, a small project, not even a major project, but it got a 6-month delay because there was a dispute with the city because one of the windows in the building was planned to be frosted glass. Okay, I want you to stop and think about that. A 6-month delay because of one of the windows was going to be frosted glass rather than clear glass, and there was a 6-month delay. So when you're talking about a project that might be hundreds of millions of dollars or acres upon acres, which is much larger than this project was, those are simply not the types of risks and delays that businesses want to incur when they can go to many, many other countries and basically have something built inside a year.
It's insane. So, all right. So we have one question from the audience. This is for any of the speakers up here. Was so far, many institutions have left commodity sector in the past years. As we enter a super cycle, do you expect to see them back, or just look at the train to pass, I guess? Do you expect people to come back into the commodity sector that we've lost in the past year? And that's for anybody. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I think one of the things that everybody keeps waiting to happen is especially, taking oil as the best example. Everybody keeps waiting for everybody to start cheating, and this, for some reason, is one of the few periods where the oil producers aren't piling in to ramp up large amounts of production outside of OPEC, and OPEC is keeping a very tight rein on production. And so whether it's oil is a great example or other areas, I think a lot of the producers seem to be really holding back on CapEx. And it's a little bit puzzling at this point why there hasn't even seemed to have been trickles out into that into higher investment. So typically when you're looking at these things and you're looking at it 2 to 4 years in advance, it's tough to see where's there that flood of investment into boosting commodity production either in the U.S. or nearby neighbors or even really globally. So I think that's something that has a lot of people puzzled.
Well, yeah, the Western governments aren't exactly helping by saying we want to phase you out by 2030. So,
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Not a lot of incentive there to expand early. All right, so we're coming up on the hour, so we'll do the regular round. We'll start with Ross. So, tell us one thing we really should be looking at in supply chains far out, for the next, say, 1 to 3 years, or address something that you would like to address that we haven't addressed so far.
Yeah, this is probably not unfamiliar terrain for a lot of people, but it may be for some, is that there is, and I'm party to some of it, in some critical sectors, there is growing not only awareness, but willingness amongst the trading and export class in China to participate in and utilize supply chains as a weapon. For a long time, it was win-win. It was how do we work together? And then the sneaky stuff would happen when, maybe maneuvers to throw a contract slightly out of compliance so that they can leverage a 2% discount, that kind of thing. Those types of things were pretty common and baked in, and everybody who's done trade with China knows that. But it's becoming open. I mean, it was just 4 weeks ago, a trader of food and feed ingredients based in China said to my face, what is the U.S. going to do when China cuts off vitamin exports to the U.S.? And like I said, that's not just, Fred Flintstone vitamins. These are critical things that we need to maintain meat, dairy, protein production, egg production. If those go away, we're talking an 8 to 10% or 8 to 10x, excuse me, increase in prices of those things. And I'm talking within 90 days of them being shut off. The US doesn't carry supply of that. So when we look at these critical dependencies, everybody's aware of the antibiotic shortages, the Adderall shortages, the soft escalation of critical resources, upstream materials that come to the US for things we need. It's already ongoing. It's not notional, it's not theoretical, it's already ongoing, and there is not but maybe 50 people in the entire the US government that are aware of it or care about it. So pressure in that way, pressure to look at the trade data to really contemplate what's going on here. The other thing would be that the Pacific Maritime Association and the ILWU, the longshoremen, they need to get their act together. The slow walking, the slow downs, that type of stuff has begun again. And there's a perverse incentive for the ocean carriers whose rates have collapsed from the historic highs of the last couple of years. There is a perverse incentive for them to actually draw out and drag on the pain at the ports to get their way, because it also means capacity is diminished, velocity of vessels is diminished, and they can increase rates back to a level they want to be at. So you look at those two things, the trans-Pacific trade paradigm is only escalating in risk, even compared to where we were over the last 2 years.
So basically, supply chains is a weapon, and we could still continue to see shortages of some things. Is that
certain thing? Yeah. So yeah, we'll still have PlayStation 5s on the shelf. Everybody was kind of worried about things that mattered at Christmas time. The tactics appear to be changing to one more of things that never make the news, but will have enormously impactful feelings throughout not only the U.S. economy, but really in people's individual pocketbooks.
Thank you very much. So we'll be sure to look out for that. Chris, your final thoughts and or address something that we haven't addressed. And again, something we really should pay a close attention to, for the next 1 to 3 years.
So the thing that I'm going to touch upon is slightly different, and it's this. The U.S. has actually been, trade levels with China have been stagnant now for a little while, and a lot of China's trade surplus is actually starting to come more and more from other countries. And the reason that matters is for many years, they were basically running balanced trade or even trade deficits with the rest of the world, excluding the U.S. So as the U.S. was complaining about as the U.S. was complaining about Chinese trade policies, it kind of fell on deaf ears throughout the rest of the world. If this trend continues, where China is still getting the same level of trade surplus and just reallocating it to different areas of the world, that is going to radically change as other countries and other companies face the same problems that the U.S. has faced. That is going to radically rechange things. And there is a real opportunity for the U.S. to go out and change the board. I think it was Ross that alluded to this issue of in parts of the world where China could go in and do stuff, and they would say, well, where's the U.S.? What's the U.S. deal? And I heard that refrain constantly throughout Asia when you would travel, as they said, we'd love for the U.S. to be more involved. We'd love for U.S. companies or the U.S. government to do more stuff. They're just not here. They're just absent. So if the U.S. Can do things, and I think there's a variety of ways to do this that raise the influence, help secure supply chains, and change the game. I think there's a lot of scope for that to happen.
Thank you very much. And Tony, your final thoughts? Same thing. Same question.
Okay. Tracy, guys, I think this is great. My view is that nothing will change. So, we're going to muddle along. The U.S. is probably going to do the same thing that it's done for the past 10 years. China is going to continue to extract what it extracts through trade relationships, and really nothing will change. We will see things change from the private sector perspective. As we saw Apple move some manufacturing to India and so on. We'll see those things happen because companies don't want to be caught out with supply chain disruptions. But I think from the nation state kind of trade agreement or whatever level, I'm just not optimistic that we're going to see a lot change because, in the US, everyone in Congress is like 128 years old and, they just don't really care. So, we're going to muddle along for the next 10 years and we're going to rely on shareholders to push private sector companies to have resilient supply chains.
Well, thank you for that uplifting.
Yeah, anytime. I'm always here.
All right, you guys, thank you very much to all of the speakers today. Make sure you check out newkitedata.com. That's Chris's site, fortisanalysis.substack.com, which is Ross's, and completeintel.com, which is Tony's company. Please follow them on Twitter. They all have great information and tweets every day. So please make sure to follow placeyourtrades.com to find out about upcoming events. And I sent a tweet out for the link for the Trade Debate app. If anybody wants to check that out, that's free. And then again, thank you guys for taking the time out today. I know you guys are really busy, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. And we'll see you next Wednesday on Spaces.